So, as a human species, of course, we're concerned, at least conceptually, for what happens in 150, 200, 300 years to humanity. But it seems an awful long way off, and a lot of people still don't see the short-term impacts of climate change. People even joke about the fact that it'd be nice if the summers were longer and things were warmer. Can you give us a few examples of the impacts of climate change that are already with us?
Sure. I like to, in this long-term perspective, which I agree is hard for people to get motivated about. I think of it, climate change is, sort of missing all of our brain's motivational go buttons in that regard. But I do think that it's important that people recognize that there are consequences right now, and that addressing the root causes of climate change will promote health as well. So along the first line, we've already seen changes to pollen production as a very simple example, where both carbon dioxide and warming contribute to influence the production of ragweed pollen, poison ivy, other allergenic plants. And that's in one case simply based upon the carbon dioxide. Carbon dioxide for some plants can be a fairly potent fertilizer. We've seen the oceans acidify. So by putting carbon dioxide into the atmosphere, some of that, about a third of it, gets absorbed into the oceans. That makes the oceans more acidic. Organisms like coral reefs have calcium carbonate backbones that don't do well when the oceans get more acidic. There's evidence that already with the amount of acidity in the oceans, it may be affecting the ability of some species to reproduce. And that will likely continue. Heat waves. We've already seen, evidence that heat waves are becoming more intense, and that signal is likely to increase. The consequences of heat waves we've seen time and again, depending upon the ability of the location where the heat wave sets in to cope with it. We've seen hundreds, tens of deaths to tens of thousands of deaths with these heat waves. I think there's a lot of concern about how climate change is already affecting the location and distribution of both vector-borne and waterborne diseases. I think it's harder to really put a finger on the vector-borne disease problem, although if I were a gambling man and I was deciding whether or not to change the planet or betting on changing the planet as we are with climate change or not in terms of the likelihood that infectious diseases like malaria or dengue would spread, I would certainly not bet on what we're doing as the best way to prevent that. But with waterborne disease, a lot of the big cities in the world have combined sewer systems where stormwater and sewage water get combined. Heavy rainfalls, as I've said, we've already seen with climate change, are impacting the likelihood that those systems will be overwhelmed, and as a result pumping raw sewage into places where people swim. People may be getting fresh water or potable water, so forth. So I think that on that side there's a lot already happening. But I think it's even more important to point out that reducing carbon dioxide emissions carries immense co-benefits. So air pollution, burning fossil fuels produces air pollution that kills people. It turns out that food waste, roughly 30% of all the calories that are produced on the planet get thrown in the garbage. If you took all of that, it would roughly, and you took the carbon footprint of that, it'd be about the third biggest country in terms of emissions. So what would happen if we reduce food waste? Well, we'd substantially reduce our carbon footprint. We'd have more, food hopefully available to people who needed it. We'd dramatically save on our water waste. So there's huge, water embedded in that. And there'd be a pollution reduction because, of course, we use fossil fuels to produce food. There's also, in terms of transportation, if we were able to have better public transit systems and more people were able to use them, we'd reduce air pollution in cities, and the list goes on and on and on and on. So I think, yes, there's evidence that climate change is having a consequence to people's health now. I think even more important is that if we address the root causes of climate change and even talk about deforestation, there are substantial benefits to people's health. I might mention along those lines is our center did an analysis of the Clean Power Rule that was proposed by the EPA, and that will save thousands of lives if implemented because of the effects of that upon particulate matter, air pollution, particularly interesting in places like Ohio, Pennsylvania, West Virginia, in the United States. So, that's just one example of how these effects on carbon dioxide can actually translate directly into health benefits.
So let's break this down a little bit into specific causes. So sea level rise, again, millimeters per year doesn't seem too dramatic.
Yeah.
It seems to give us plenty of time as a planet to move a little further away from the seashore, to go up on stilts, to put in mitigation possibilities, early warning systems of storms coming, this sort of stuff. Why should we be so worried about sea level rise and its impact on health?
Sure. So it's absolutely true that, millimeters per year does not get most people interested. I think it's important, again, to remember that sea level rise that's a global average and that it's not equal everywhere. But even if we're twice that, 6 millimeters is probably not going to get people necessarily concerned. I think one thing to bear in mind is that just in the past year, there's been a substantial revisions to the prospects for sea level rise that say that it's probably going to happen a lot faster than we thought, even in the last IPCC report, and that the biggest wild card out there is how quickly the Greenland and Antarctic ice sheets will melt, and we know from the past that the Earth there were no ice caps on the Earth. We know that if those things melt, it raises sea level. Just the West Antarctic ice sheet could raise sea level by 12 feet, and so we should not necessarily use the benchmark of the rate of rise right now. We should look at what we know about melting ice and raising seas based upon temperature. So. What does that mean for health? Well, one, we're already seeing populations being displaced by sea level rise. So there are people in Louisiana who recently were told that the federal government is no longer going to protect them from the effects of storm surges and sea level rise, which have been happening in this coastal area on the coast of Louisiana in the Gulf of Mexico for a long time. But given the amount of sea level rise already and the projections, the government said we just can't countenance investing more money here because there's no way we can really protect you adequately. These are the first climate refugees in the United States. But people in Shishmaref, Alaska, who, for instance, as many people way up, this is up in the Aleutian Islands of Alaska, use permafrost to store their food. That plus sea level rise, the melting of the ice plus sea level rise has made it impossible for them to live there. So they're leaving. The South Pacific Islands, the island nation of Kiribati has made an agreement with Fiji. They've actually bought land in Fiji, and they have a program now where residents can move there at their will, knowing that their island is not going to be viable in the near term. So sea level rise has already caused population displacement. It will continue to cause population displacement. If you want to find the least healthy people on the globe, there's a good chance you'll find them in populations of people who have been forced to move against their will for whatever reason. I think in a broader context, as sea level rise continues, huge numbers of people, and depending upon what distance from the coast you measure, it's a different fraction of the population, but most people live on coast. People are moving to cities, as we know, and those, in most countries, those cities are on coast. That's where people live. And yet, at the same time, a lot of those cities were built on great river deltas, be it in this, South Asia, United States, and Europe, and those are at sea level. So we have the situation where people are moving to cities. Those cities are low-lying coastal areas, sea levels rising. And that poses huge concerns for waterborne disease outbreaks, for flooding, for food insecurity. So, a lot of cities are importing food through ships, and if the docks are not operable, and so you see these ripple effects. And cities that have the resources are planning for this. So there's real money being poured into protecting Venice, to protecting Amsterdam, although they've been way ahead of the curve, to protecting Boston, to protecting all of these places that it's clear sea level rise will substantially affect their ability to keep the city operational, let alone their citizens above water.